computer. Okay, hello. Welcome to our second session where we are going to be continuing our theological and halakhic discussion on the issues around homosexuality. For the past few sessions, we've been engaging with the thinking of Rabbi Gordon Tucker. Rabbi Tucker, former dean of the Jewish Theological Seminary's Rabbinical School, amazing rabbi for many years in White Plains, a professor of mine, and he has been putting forth a meta-halakhic understanding of halakha that is necessary in those situations in which there is perhaps a disagreement or at least an overwhelming or overriding moral implication that we cannot find a way to make work in the system. So there's a lot that I could recap for you here, but what I'm going to do now is, as quickly as possible, I'm going to do a very brief review of the last session that we had on the 24th. And I'm going to not recap everything, but just take us up to where we had left off, which really was where Gordon, Rabbi Tucker, was going to propose his additional, his new solution. I'm getting a little noise there, so if someone can just mute, that would be very helpful. And I'm certainly going to pause and take time for questions, and a few of you have even emailed me in between the last session and this session. So the question that Rabbi Tucker asked in December of 2006 was, can homosexuality, both male and female, be reconciled with Judaism, conceived through a halakhic lens? Specifically, can Jews who are living sexual lives with partners of the same sex be considered to be the subject to the same obligations and entitled to the same rights as those whose sexual lives are with members of the opposite sex? He's really talking about the normalization of Jewish gays and lesbians. And of course, this is rather significant, as one of the things that I mentioned was during my time at rabbinical school, which began in 2002, you were not permitted to be an openly gay or lesbian student. And so there were classmates of mine who, out of necessity, were following what was a don't ask, don't tell closeted policy, which was morally offensive to a good number of us. And Rabbi Tucker is speaking directly to that. So what he wants to argue, we went through the last time how the debate has developed. And the debate has developed based upon these two key concepts. And I don't want to go back too many sessions because I think we remember the Oven of Achnai story in which the Sanhedrin is having a dispute and the voice of God comes in and to let people know that the dispute is on the side of the minority, to which the head of the Sanhedrin says, get out of here, we don't count the voice of God in the system, lo b'shamayim hi. What Tucker has understood that to mean is that we have two options, and this was his paper that we studied on the 17th. We have two options with how we are going to understand God in all of this. Either we are going to continue what is a legal positivist frame, which says the most important thing, the thing that sits at the foundation, is the Torah. And above that and built on top of that are going to be interpretations and laws that develop over thousands of years. And that at the root of it sits on this, what they call a Grundnorm, a foundation of the belief that God transmitted the Torah. And he says that's an as if. We're just going to take it as an assumption. It's as if God transmitted the Torah. And from that, as if, we have this entire positive legal system which develops and builds off of that, and which we are bound to in terms of what we can and can't eat, or so on and so forth. It's been developed over thousands of years, and it's a workable system like any system of laws. And he'll get into that in depth today. The other option is the option which comes from the Tanur of Achnai, which is the Bat Kol, the voice of God, is reaching out and yelling out. And Tucker wants to say that this is a voice that has to go heard. right? Either we're going to accept God as an as if, or we're going to accept God as real. And if we accept God as real, there might be instances in which God, the voice of God is heard through the oppressed. The voice of God is heard through minorities, the voice of God who are heard through injustice. That voice needs to be heard and recognized. Otherwise, God will forever be an as if, and we don't actually believe in a God that is real. Obviously, for reasons I've discussed in previous sessions, this is very compelling to me. And I think it's very important the way that he's going about explaining all of this. And so he begins, and we discussed this in the last session, to talk about the history of halakha and what is called agadah. So agadah, those are the narratives, those are the stories, those are the legends that give meaning to our lives. And as we discussed 3 weeks ago, thinkers have said that's the ikar of our tradition. The central part of our tradition are those morals and those stories and that legends that make up the Jewish people. However, none of that is traditionally allowed in the halachic framework because it doesn't have the same, it's not a part of that same foundation. It's not a part of that same system which is developed. Okay, so he goes through this, and we talked about takanot, which I am not going to get into today. And then he talked about the history of the issue of homosexuality, in which he cites Rabbi Roth's teshuvah from 1991, that he tried to find a way through this legal positivist system of questions and answers and precedent and stare decisis to allow for the normalization of gays and lesbians, but he could not do it because of two explicit verses, 1822 and 2013 in the book of Leviticus, which says, do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman, mishkaveh isha, it is an abhorrence, to'eva. All right, so that is language that Rabbi Roth ultimately found that he could not get around. All right, so why are those the arguments? And then Roth breaks down all of the different arguments against the normalizations of homosexual behavior in Judaism. The first is the theological argument, which says the verse is really clear. It's just super clear on its face. And to say it doesn't mean what it means will undercut our entire understanding of the Torah. Really creatively, as we discussed in the last session, Rabbi Tucker breaks down that assumption and says we don't ever decide issues of halakha based on the pshat, the plain sense text of the Torah. It's always through this process. So even to go back and to say, well, look at this text, it's clear, it's not clear. And that's also not how we discuss things. Secondly, he also says, most of these texts and most of these hard cases have been subject to thousands of years of dispute. We've been arguing about it. We've been using different precedent. We've been contextualizing it. We've been explaining the portion in different ways. And so this dispute has not happened in the realm of homosexuality. But it has happened in the realm of other oppressed peoples, which he is going to talk about. And he's going to say, because this hasn't been the case, we haven't asked this question. We don't have 2,000 years worth of jurisprudence, of opinion, of dissent, and of creative thinking to rely on. And in other words, this makes it a case of first impression. And finally, he also says, well, we're conservative Jews. We don't believe that the text of the Torah is inerrant. It's perfect in every single word. Rather, he writes, we can believe in God. We can believe in revelation. We can believe that it's meaningful to speak of a divine will and to have faith in the idea of Torah. But he also says that there's an understanding, and he quotes Heschel, that as an interpretation of God's will, the Torah is itself a midrash. It is itself an agadah, which is inevitably mediated through human hands. All right, I'm going to skip through because I don't want to spend all of our time doing a recap of the last session. And then he shares two very moving letters, which we concluded with the last time, from yeshiva students who are gay, who send letters to Yeshaya Leibowitz, and the response that they get back from him. is for the most part, you're going to have to be, what does he say? He says, basically, you are going to have to be, I forget, you're going to have to suffer for this. And there's no way around it. And he says, look, I haven't experienced that suffering myself, but this is the suffering that you have been asked to take on. All right, so what we concluded last session, here it is, 29-year-old student, we concluded in the last session that this was not the response that we would like to ask. Here it is, you are one of those upon whom has been laid the severe decree to be sorely tested, same tests that were laid on Abraham and Job. So if you're concerned about Judaism and ask how it can be reconciled with homosexuality, the answer is it's impossible. The prohibition on the homosexual sex is absolute. It leaves no room for leniency. Okay, so notice Rabbi Tucker writes that positivism, the system that we have adopted, is able to offer each of these men either Kiddush Hashem, so heroic martyrdom, or going into the closet. And we, as conservative Jews, and in particular as, well, as human beings, we feel like a system that operates in this fashion, that concludes with a question, with a command that you either remain in the closet or that you become a martyr for the sake of Hashem, is immoral. It's not right. And what bothers Tucker the most is that it's based on an as if, where if we are saying, well, we're going to take this whole system as if God wrote the Torah, but we're not really going to listen to the voice of God, he's saying, well, that's an unbelievable burden and pain and suffering to put on any human being for an as if. And so what he proposes here, and this is the continuation, this is where we left off, an alternative enhanced halachic model. So how can we retain the value of positivism? And if you remember from last week, we cited Oliver Wendell Holmes, which talked about the needing to create a system of laws that we can rely on, that is dependable, where we can know what to do. There's some consistency to it. And therefore, it has to build on one on the other. We have to build on past precedent. We have to build on previous decisions. And there should be some consistency, some reliability. And Tucker's argument is that there are some cases in which they are so large that they do not work, that those small rules don't work. He actually gives a very effective comparison in which he talks about Euclidean geometry. I can't find it at this exact moment, but he talks about Euclidean geometry, and he says Euclid for the most part works until Einstein points out the theory of relativity, and at this point Euclidean geometry no longer works. So he says that doesn't mean it's not valuable. It doesn't mean, but it means it's not going to be applied on some large cases that concern huge issues. Those small little games and those rules that we play to maintain consistency aren't going to apply. And therefore, we need something that not only takes into consideration this legal positivist framework, but we also need something that will take into consideration our legends, our agadah, and our values. Okay, so he writes here, we seek a method that could retain the advantages of positivism for most cases, but avoid the relatively infrequent yet vexing failures of positivism to produce the legal results that our deepest intuitions and consciences guide us to. In doing so, we do well to keep in mind what was urged above, that the conservative Judaism has long since made a commitment to theology that acknowledges that, number one, the text of the Torah is not necessarily God's word, and thus not an infallible expression of God's will. Two, that human beings have a critical role in the generation of perfection and religious truth. And three, that the fulfillment of God's will not only allows, but requires the engagement from religious communities. This means, of course, halacha is going to change, but that is hardly characteristic of what this theology entails. So he says, positivists, after all, have never denied that halacha changes. The deeper consequence of our theology is that the Torah is not a record of commanding utterances from God. All right, listen to this again. The deeper consequence of our theology is that the Torah is not a record of commanding utterances from God. Right? We have the 10 utterances, Serta Dibrot, but our theology says it's not a record of commanding utterances from God, but rather a record of the religious quests of a people and of their understanding of how God's will commands them. The long-standing and understandable tendency to divide up religious literature into halakha and agadah has thus been a mistake. We have to take our legends into consideration. Because we have not done so, we end up with conclusions in which we tell people that they have to be celibate for their entire lives for reasons that have nothing, totally out of their control. And he says we have to find a way to get agadah into that. And he goes to Robert Cover. Maybe you're familiar with Robert Cover. He's a legal theorist. And he claims that, he says, consider the case of the civil rights sit-in movement from 1961 until 1964. The movement's community affirmed that the Constitution of the United States had a valid moral claim to obedience from the members of the community. Yet the community also affirmed an understanding of the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection includes a right to be served in public places of accommodation, regardless of race. In the face of official interpretations of the Constitution that permitted continued discriminatory practices in public accommodations, the movement had this choice. It could conform its behavior to the official law while protesting that the law was wrong, or it could conform its public behavior to its own interpretation of the Constitution. So there is both disobedience and obedience in either case, but only obedience to the movement's own interpretation of the Constitution. And that was only their obedience to but only obedience to the movement's own interpretation of the Constitution was fidelity to the understanding of law by which the movement's members would live uncoerced. Thus, in acting out their own free interpretation of the Constitutions, protesters say, we do mean this in the medium of blood. Our lives constitute the bridges between the reality of present official declarations of law and the vision of our law triumphant. Right? So Tucker thinks this is wonderful and says, Cover did not, of course, have our case in mind when he wrote this word, but it hardly could be more pertinent. He says the parallels are striking here between how are we going to understand this particular, how are we going to understand this law? What is the law that we are going to be obedient or disobedient to? So where he says here is that he mentions the letters from the two young men. And he acknowledges that there are people who are fully committed group who are elaborating and still elaborating the norms for their sexual lives that stand against the state or against the halakhic establishment. They agree that halakha has a valid moral claim to obedience by the community. They're not doing away with halakha writ large. We believe in halakha, but it's not like we just do away with the Constitution in the sit-in, except the Constitution that we're going to adhere to is interpreted in a different way. But they have also affirmed that the Jewish legal tradition positive emphasis on sexual fulfillment, companionship, and family life must include space for romantic love and sexual attraction other than for the canonical heterosexuality. And and they have always been faced with this choice. A, proclaim the official interpretation of halakha to be wrong, but conform behavior to it, all right? So we can say that the official interpretation of halakha was wrong, and we're gonna remain in the closet, or conform public behavior to their own interpretation of halakha and accept the consequences. So gay and lesbian Jews who live their real lives openly have chosen fidelity and commitment to the understanding of halakha that allows them to live uncoerced. In doing so, they have in effect said our lives constitute the bridges between the reality of present official interpretations of halakha and the vision of our interpretation of halakha triumphant. This is our test. Shall we see ourselves as defenders of the official precedents against those who are constructing new legal interpretations out of the necessities of their reality? Or should we be part of a bridge that links the official version of halakha with the reality of the people with whom the official version would condemn to celibacy? All right, now I know this question has come up, which is about the status of other peoples who might be similar to homosexuals. Those are people who have statuses that prevent them from having meaningful, loving relationships. And a few people have asked me, how has the conservative movement dealt with this in the past? And why doesn't this also apply to homosexuality? Well, Tucker is right with you. So if you've been thinking that, he's right there with you. And he says, consider what we did first with women. He says, before there was any legal arguments for the full egalitarian approach for women in the synagogue and the house of studies, we first had to come up with a vision of what that would look like. There first had to be perhaps a community of women committed to Judaism, not only women and men, in a way that included ritual and liturgical traditionalism, but their own narrative. All right. So basically, there had to be these communities, these egalitarian communities that valued the tradition, that took halakha seriously, but that interpreted in a way that was inclusive of women. Okay, so, and of course, one of the key pieces that this effort to include women in a fully egalitarian way, it was augmented by such classical agadic texts as this one, which strongly suggests that the discriminations we humans make are not God's will. All right, so let me just go back because I skipped this. The vision of those egalitarian communities was not born of a straight derivation from halakhic precedents along derivational pathways. Instead, it was a coming together of a halakhic tradition that those communities felt bound to, along with an agadah, a narrative that began with the very beginning of our scripture, which says, Lo tov hayav adam levado, it's not good for a person to be alone. God created both male and females. And they also quote the daughters of Zelophehad, which we just studied 2 weeks ago in Parshat Pinchas. And here it says that once the daughters of Zelophehad had heard that the land was being divided amongst the tribes, but to males and not females, they got together to seek each other's counsel. They said to one another, God's mercy is not like the mercy of other human beings. For human beings have more compassion for males than for females, but the Holy and Blessed One is not like that. God's compassion extends to both males and females. God's compassion extends to everyone. So these narratives were amplified by the history of women, of piety, of courage, of ability, and most of all by the undeniable reality that contemporary women were fully capable of assuming equal roles, and the growing conviction that to deny them these roles was to unjustly thwart sincere, pure religious yearnings. The vision that grew out of this blend of halakha and narrative informed the practices of more and more communities, which in time came to include synagogues and chavarot, college communities. Maybe you know about partnership minyanim. This is still, all of this stuff still happening. These communities, modern Orthodox communities at the moment, trying to figure out what's an authentic, let's not do away with the halakha, but what's an authentic way that we can express egalitarianism. Now, although the story of the normalization of women in conservative Judaism parallels what Cover described in terms of the communities, once the recognition had developed that halakha had to accommodate the reality of traditional egalitarian communities, our movement rose to the challenge. And it did so by largely demonstrating in a positive mode that there were ways to locate such equalization of women's roles in the synagogue. So basically what he's saying is, once it became clear that there were these minyanim that were taking place, that people wanted to gather in a community where women were fully included in all of this, Tucker is saying, we stepped up. Rabbi Roth wrote a teshuvah that allowed for the ordination of women. We affirmed egalitarianism. This was 40 years ago. And not only that, he also points out that this was done, though in the traditional fashion, this was done in the legal positivist way. And there are some limits, Rabbi Tucker points out, to the positivist analysis that came up last week and came up in this conversation with regard to egalitarianism. Now, Dr. Shai Wald wrote, this is an unpublished paper on the status of women. So he goes through in a similar way that Rabbi Roth did in a positive mode, using halachic sources to demonstrate the legitimacy of equalizing women and gender roles in the synagogues. But at the end, he's forced to concede that he is unable to do so for blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. So they are fully equal, fully egalitarian. Women can do everything in the shul. They can do Hagbah. They just can't blow the shofar. Now, thus, his paper argues for women counting in the minyan being required to pray as men 3 times a day, being qualified to lead prayers for both men and women, and of course the prayers on Rosh Hashanah, but not qualified to blow the shofar. The oddity of this result, and we talked about this in our last session, about homosexual men can participate in sex acts if they are standing up, because it says you shall not lie down with another man as you would a woman. So maybe you should stand there. And I learned the last session that there are some Hasidic gay men who have sex standing up. Or perhaps, according to our own movement, with the Dorf Nevins Reisner Teshuvah, which says gay men can participate in a loving relationship, they just can't perform anal sex. This oddity, as the word that Tucker uses, the oddity of this sort of result, in effect, proves its legitimacy and authority to the positivist. This is a shine. He's saying this is being legitimate. I know it's odd. Women can do everything but blow the shofar. Men can do everything but anal sex, but that proves my legitimacy to the positivist. The analysis went as far as it could and permitted only what was permitted while ruling out what was not. The willingness to tolerate or even welcome anomalies such as this for the sake of precedential purity remains one of the signature weaknesses of the positivist program. Still, conservative Judaism takes pride, as it should, in having risen to the challenge during that moment in which we ordained women as rabbis. All right, so I think it's a wonderful point, and it really goes to the heart of what he is going to argue here, is that we are willing to tolerate unacceptable conclusions because we want to be perceived as being precedentially pure. And he says that really is a signature weakness of our halachic system. And the fact that we can, with pride, say that gay men can be married but can't have anal sex is not a sign of our legitimacy, but rather a sign of our weakness. He goes on and he now brings up another status of the aguna. As some of you are probably aware, an aguna is a woman who is technically tied to a husband in marriage, and that husband is refusing to deliver a get. If any of you have seen The Sopranos, there's a famous episode of The Sopranos in which they're hired to go intimidate an ex-husband who will not deliver a get to, there's a religious community and they need help from the Sopranos crew. So they want to break the guy's legs so that he delivers a get to his wife, because the ex-wife, is not able to remarry without a get. And according to tradition, has no ability to bring about her own divorce. She basically has to wait for the husband to deliver the get. So there are similarities, Rabbi Tucker argues, between the aguna was viewed by the halachists and how Jewish gays and lesbians have come to be treated by the halachists today. He says that there was enormous sympathy for the aguna. There still is. I mean, if you pick up, a very religious paper in Brooklyn, you might flip through and see some ads attempting to shame ex-husbands. into giving their wives gets. There's a lot of sympathy and a lot of effort on the part of Orthodox communities to compel men to give gets because of how wrong it is to have a woman in this status. It was acknowledged that she had no control over her situation. The predicament was not her fault. Nevertheless, there seemed to be no way to legitimate any sexual relationship that she might desire to have. He goes, yes, there were case-by-case attempts to alleviate their suffering, but each solution was idiosyncratic. Now, he says the case of the community of Agunot was not as well defined as these egalitarian communities or these partnership minions, or as well defined as the gay community and the religious communities that they were forming. But at the same time, the halachists pursued their positive method because they wanted to figure out how they could solve this suffering that seemed unjust. These women were basically prevented from having any sexual relations going forward. And after assessment of the word as being good, they found that it's not good for a man to be alone, a human being to be alone. Compassion, companionship, physical intimacy were seen from the very beginning as prerequisites of a life. So to deprive someone of that for reasons that are beyond her control would be a betrayal of our narrative as Jews. It's not good for a person to be alone. That's essential to how we understand who we are. So to require her to be alone for something out of her control, not acceptable. Moreover, Judaism has developed over time yet another narrative, in part enshrined in law, that rejected the practice of punishing people and causing them undue suffering for things that they're also not responsible for. So we've got all of these legends and morals and stories. Not good to be alone. We don't punish people for things that they haven't done or are responsible for. And then he quotes this from Leviticus Rabbah. And this deals with the case of mamzerim. So again, like an agunah, who can't remarry. A mamzer is a misbegotten child of adultery or of incest, who was also denied historically. They couldn't get married. You weren't permitted to marry someone who was born out of wedlock, or adultery, or incest. And so here's Leviticus Rabbah. Again, this is legend. It's not Leviticus, it's a legend. And it says, I further observed all those who were being oppressed under the sun. The quote from the book of Ecclesiastes. The tears of the oppressed with none to comfort them, and the power of their oppressors with none to comfort them. Hanina the tailor interpreted this verse as applying to mamzerim. I further observed all those who were being oppressed. These are the mamzerim. The tears of the oppressed, the mothers of these people committed sins, and we isolate them. Here's a man whose father committed adultery. But what did he himself do, and what business is it of his? With none to comfort them, but rather the power of their oppressors. This refers to Israel's great Sanhedrin, which imposes on them the full power of the Torah and isolates them on the basis of this verse. No one misbegotten shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. With no one to comfort them, God therefore says, it must be my task to bring them comfort, for it is in this world that they are deemed to be expendable. But in a future world, it will be as the prophet Zechariah envisioned. I see a lampstand all of gold. All right, so Rabbi Tucker is going to explain this a little bit. He's going to say that among the many striking things that are subversive in this text are one, it's a clear depiction of the injustice inherent in making people suffer for things they cannot control. Core value of Judaism. Two, it identifies the great Sanhedrin, which is the very embodiment of halakhic authority, as the oppressor of the mamzerim. And three, that God is not on the side of the narrow halakha of the Sanhedrin, but rather envisions a broader sense of commandment and community that will include the mamzerim. All right, so then we're going to go ahead and see, so how did our movement deal with these issues? So in 1951, David Aronson articulated a response as it applied to the Agunot, and here's how he put it. There were strict judges in Talmudic days who argued let the law pierce the mountain, which means let the law take its course, no matter how rigid and harsh it may be in any particular case. But none of the master builders of the halakha ever maintained let the law destroy justice. If alive today, none of them, if we may take their reaction to the problems of their days as criteria, would smugly accept a situation where it is not the mountains, but the very heart of the authority of the halakha that is being pierced. So Aronson did not reject the halakha. He accepted the principle. There's no one else home. He accepted the principle. Sorry, I'm going to keep going. I lost my place there. Which means that the law does not make he accepted the principle that the law will not make demands upon us, inconvenience us, restrain our autonomy, as it must do so for the sake of a continuity of culture. And he appealed to the halakhic concept of hafka'at kedushin, the rabbinic power to terminate a marital relationship for this solution. Now, no one had ever used hafka'at kedushin previously in the case dealing with an aguna. It's true, it was a new use, and it was the result of the power of narratives emanating from an undeniably real community of the oppressed, creating a new legal reality in the style of the received tradition and indubitably in its spirit. Think of conservative Judaism's great accomplishments in authorizing marital and sexual fulfillment for agunot in terms of, he writes, Kronman's metaphor about cultures. I believe I skipped that, but let me scroll down here. He talks about artistic masterpieces, and basically artistic masterpieces only work in which they fuse two different styles. They often need to be the work of not only the work of various generations, but also the fusion of two styles in order to meet the expressive needs of the age. Now, perhaps another critical element, law follows a similar pattern. Certain legal methods may suffice to produce and reflect the law, the values of a culture, but eventually prove inadequate by themselves to express in law what needs to be expressed. Traditions other than the familiar legal precedents may then have to be appealed to and borrowed from in order to create new law that stands and functions only because the integration was accomplished for the first time. All right, so this thought experiment will give you a sense of what happened in the Aronson response. The received halakhic pathways all by themselves simply could not relieve the suffering of agunot. Similarly, the justice narratives of Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, and Leviticus Rabbah could not by themselves create the constancy of a legal order and the stability of a sanctified view of marriage and family. Only together could they achieve both noble goals. He says this is exactly Cover's concept of law when he wrote about law constituting a bridge from the present reality to an envisioned better reality. Now, Tucker says it's not anarchy, and I'm not rejecting halakhic process, but we have to come up with a solution. We can't just say business as usual if halakhic precedent only has the answer of celibacy to committed gays and lesbians. That the time has come to merge those narratives and precedents once again, as we did in the cases of agunot and mamzerim. And for those cases, we identified two powerful motifs in our Agadic tradition. One, lo tov heyot adam levado, it is not good for a human being to be alone. And B, the critique in Leviticus Rabbah of the cruel and short-sighted treatment of the innocent victims of the rules. And Tucker says, both of these key Agadic, both of these key central moral values, not good for a person to be alone. We do not punish people who are innocent victims of rules. Those apply no less in the treatment of gays and lesbians than they do for agunot and mamzerim. He says we take pride in having answered the calls of the latter two, and it will ultimately be to our shame and to our detriment if we do not hear the cries of our oppressed brothers and sisters on whom it has been decreed that they cannot fulfill both their human and Jewish needs simultaneously. It is a moment of opportunity for conservative Judaism in which we can demonstrate the power of our commitment and compassion, and in which our concept of law can be expanded and not contracted. This is just how this merging of halakha and agadah can and should be accomplished is now the section to come up. All right, so I just want to pause here. I can probably do the last 15 minutes, but I just wanted to pause to see if there are any questions before we get to what he's going to proffer. But does everyone understand how we've handled the agunot and the mamzerim up to this point? And the movement for 70 years, longer than 70 years, has said that we can't countenance this. We have to find a way to create some meta-halachic principle. We cannot let agunot not be able to remarry, and we cannot let mamzerim suffer for this so far. And he says both of the values, agadic values, the legends, the morals, the ikar of the tradition, they apply totally equally when it comes to the case of gays and lesbians. Are there any questions here?
Rabbi, I do have a question.
Yeah.
It's confusion on my part. I thought that a couple of weeks ago we had established that the pasuk, v'etzachar lo tishkav, etc., was particularly.
He's going to break it down for you. He's going to break it. That's the next section. Yeah.
No, I thought that we were talking about anal sex. Was I right or wrong?
You are right. So the Dorf Nevins Reisner tshuva ultimately determines that they cannot get around that one pasuk, and they limit that pasuk to meaning exclusively anal sex, in much the same way that Shai Wald just said women can do everything but blow the shofar.
So in that case, when you use the word celibate, you don't actually mean celibate. You mean celibate with regard to this particular act. I just want to understand the words correctly here, what we're talking about.
I think there is a fundamental, disagreement that Rabbi Tucker is having with the Dorf Nevins Reisner Teshuvah and how it was resulted in. And for him, the idea that you can say have sexual relations but not anal sex is ridiculous, and in essence would require a type of celibacy in a certain way that he doesn't want to consign people to. Even if they can fully be rabbis and they can get married and we can do kiddushin, to say that they can't have one particular sexual act is not a sign of our legitimacy and authenticity and how wonderful we are in chopping.
I understand.
Yeah, but
I understand
I'm missing the question. Say it again.
I guess what I'm looking for here is, it had seemed to me, I grew up gay, and when I realized that there were these injunctions against homosexuality, I understood that it meant, well, you're just not allowed to have sex with other men. At what point, at any point in the history of halakha, did it actually come to mean that, or is all of this conflated? And if this is something that we should talk about later, I'm happy to do so, but it's actually still confusing to me, even in Orthodox circles. Would a rabbi say, or before this response, would a conservative rabbi have said, unlike the letters that were just published, would they have said specifically, yes, have your gay relationship, but just don't have anal sex? And if not, why not? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
I think, to my understanding, and I could be wrong here, and I know there's another rabbi on this call, so feel free to chime in. This was novel, and this was a novel approach a creative halachic idea of how can we solve the problem of allowing gays and lesbians to be rabbis and still maintain our commitment to that verse. And I think I'm not familiar with the prohibition to, you guys can do whatever you want to do except anal sex. That was sort of new to me. At this, I don't know if that thinking predates any of that, however. That's what you're asking.
But if I'm understanding that all the rabbis understood this pasuk to mean specifically anal sex, then that's the only thing that's being.
Yeah, I think what they're saying, I think you're assuming that there is a history of jurisprudence that has determined the meaning of this verse for 2,000 years. And what we discussed last time was that it's a case of first impression. We don't have a lot of people asking these questions and minimizing this text. But I see Rabbi Yaskowitz wanted to chime in. So Rabbi Yaskowitz was a classmate of mine, and he's on this call, Rabbi.
If I'm Bob and Randy, if it might help, in terms of what Rabbi Ain just said, there's not just challenges and agreement on jurisprudence. There are significant arguments historically about precisely what that means. You know, there's a greater consensus. It refers to some kind of penetrative anal sex between men. The rabbis argue the context is very significant. That is why there are rabbis in the modern era, and if you covered this last time, Rabbi Ain, who argue that the context of a loving monogamous relationship changes that valence. But ultimately what it comes down to is there is not a clear consensus on precisely what the prohibition is, beyond the fact that it appears to be grounded in a cultural context.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. I hate you for working out and doing this at the same time. I think that's exactly right. And it's so interesting because it's like trying to figure out what your question is, Randy. I think it really does have to do with what the rabbi said. This is a case of first impression. And so probably homophobia reigned for the previous thousands of years in terms of the interpretation of this verse without ever really developing a more nuanced take of it, which we have only seen develop over the past, 50 years. Marv, and then Irene. Thanks.
You're using the underlying concept that man should not be alone as a very supportive reason for why this ruling should go through. But
correct.
Also in Genesis, of course, we have the two statements that we are our brother's keeper. That also allows for, you can't let your brother suffer. You have to have an answer. Right. Plus, you also have the idea that we're all in the image of God. So all three of these should be very positive ideas.
Beautiful.
Then I had another question.
Well, I just want to say that's exactly what Tucker is saying. And he's saying the fact that we can't use those sources in determining the law is ridiculous because that's the essence of Judaism. The three things you just listed, that's what it means to be Jewish. How can that not impact what we say in this circumstance? Okay, your second point.
If something shows up earlier in the Torah, does that make it more important than a later finding?
No, we say there's no.
These are also pre-Sinai. Does that have any? I mean, these are universal. These are universal laws.
There's an old Talmudic principle that says there's no before and there's no after in the Torah. So the idea of linear time consistency of the Torah, we don't apply. The only value would be if it came from the Torah. That gives it the status of Dioraita, and which it doesn't matter where it came. Now, perhaps you could get into, and this is a great question to ask our Talmud professor tomorrow night, perhaps you can get into how have those rabbis determined if something came from Exodus or from Shemot or from Devarim, does that give it more or less value, and have the rabbis argued back and forth? And, you know, we come tomorrow night to Rabbi Bickert's, because I think that that's a wonderful question. Aren.
I find this, the question that I believe it's Randy you asked, brings to the feeling that it really is a non-ruling, the idea of the inner sex, a very simplistic vision of the rule that came out, but it may be more the beginning of a conversation about the subject. And what I mean by that is that it almost sounds like, as the rule came out, don't lie with a man the same way you would lie with a woman, and then don't have inner sex, then you're okay. Well, what about heterosexual couples who end up having inner sex? So is that a no-no in heterosexuality, or does that eliminate the word anus as a taboo in sexuality?
Yeah. There's a pretty clear principle on this. Assuming that you're in the appropriate, if you've been married with your spouse and it is on a day that is appropriate, you have free reign. And so there is an awful text that Rabbi Yaskowitz and I studied, which compared the type of lovemaking that married couples could have to how a man, I believe it was Jeremy, likes his steak. If he likes it boiled, if he likes it on the grill, however he likes it, as long as it's in the confines of a healthy marriage, and as long as it leads to the health of that relationship, is acceptable. And that is an old text. Stuart.
Okay, I got the mic on now. Yeah, there seems to be something missing, really missing, from Gordon Tucker's analysis and the discussion that we're having, unless I just didn't hear it or didn't understand it. You know, it looks like, you know, we're talking about legal positivism, which is the traditional halakhic approach to figuring out what we can, how we can interpret Torah today. And then the other method is not just using halakha, but using meta-halakhic. And if those are the only two things that I've heard, then there's a huge hole missing. And that hole is this. What does God want us to do? Now, I realize no rabbinic group or no individual wants to say they're speaking for God. Well, you know, I wish we would. And David Hartman wrote a beautiful, beautiful book, many beautiful books, but, you know, he argued throughout the book that the God of the Jews is a loving God and is a moral God. And that is in direct opposition to someone he debated this with for much of his life, and that's Yeshayahu Leibowitz. And Yeshayahu Leibowitz, on the other extreme, says the mitzvot have little or nothing to do with morality. We don't think about why we're observing a commandment for any reason other than the fact it's a commandment from God, and that's why you do it. And so constantly going back to my initial impression, which is I wish, you know, we would talk about whether or not our God is the traditional maligned God of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and God and the Old Testament are greatly maligned as strict constructionists, literalists, slavery lovers, murderers, people who execute people, or is there God?
I think Tucker's making your case. I really do. Tucker is making your case. He's saying if our God requires gays to be celibate or to be in the closet, that's not our God. And that's the result of treating the Torah like a positive legal text and excluding God from the conversation. That ultimately is Tucker's point. And when he says Meta-Halakha, he means Meta-Halakha in the sense that you can't leave God out of it.
Good.
You can't just have this conclusion. Yeah, he's going to get to that in this third part. He's just trying to lay the foundation to say, we didn't accept this answer when it came to Mamzerim because that's not our God. And we didn't accept this answer when it came to Agunot because a God that results in that way is not our God. So the system is bust.
But just one additional comment. So if that is the approach that Tucker is comfortable with, and I'm very comfortable with it, and I suspect a lot of other people are comfortable as well, then that famous, what's the oven?
I have it. That's my second text.
Right.
That was the second. I didn't know we would Tanor Shel Achnai, and I brought that text with
right.
me.
So if we focus on that much too much, it's entirely possible that was appropriate, 1,000 years ago or more, but it may not be appropriate now. And one last thing about the oven. And I'm not sure of the facts, but basically what I've read recently is the majority of the rabbis were opposed to the single rabbi. Well, of those rabbis in the majority, one of them became an apostate later on in his life, and another one had some type of major transgression as well.
Right. And what I'm going to do, so we're obviously almost out of time. Thank you, Stuart. I'm going to get to you, Randy, for the last question.
That's
but okay. I want you to get to your question. But I next session, Stuart, what I want to do is, and I brought the oven story here, the Tanor Shel Achnai, for exactly the reason that you expressed. And so for the next session, I want to bring back the Tanor Shel Achnai text and conclude with all of Rabbi Tucker's breaking down of the verse and how the different ways that people have understood it, and how he then thinks we need to conclude so that we can validate who we are as Jews, and we can say that God is real, and that consigning people to suffer in God's name is offensive to us. So I love all of that. Now, Randy, your question.
I'll hold it for next week, Rabbi.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This was again, we're plowing through this. But we're doing it, I think, hopefully in a way that's as understandable as possible. And I think when we get to it next week, we will get to see a vision of deciding Jewish law that can view God as much greater and much bigger than that which can simply fit into a text and be understandable by all of us. Can we, like Stuart beautifully says, can we have a vision and affirm that God and play it out in a legal system at the same time? Because right now, we're separating all of those beautiful things that we believe about God from this halakhic legal positivist framework. And he wants to merge those two and thinks we need to.
Great.
So thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you next Wednesday at noon. And I'll see you then. Any questions, continue to email me if you have any more questions on this topic.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeshua.
Take care.
Yeshua.
Baruch Tihiyeh. Baruch Tihiyeh.